Art. Art is subjective. Art is perceived differently by everyone. Art is appreciated differently by everyone. From visual arts, paintings, sculptures, photography, to performing arts, music, acting, dancing, to literary arts, novels, short stories, poetry. The realm of art is too vast and complex for a single human mind to comprehend, but that is the beauty of it. One cannot capture the magnitude of its brilliance in a single song, a single drawing, or a single picture. Even individual forms of art have their own vastness and complexity. Art itself is a universe in which multiple galaxies reside. The galaxy of writing is one I like to explore, particularly the planet of poetry. Even on this poetry planet, there are various continents. There is narrative poetry, there is dramatic poetry, and there is lyric poetry. There are acrostic poems, sonnets, haikus, epics, ballads, and countless others. There is an entire dimension of poetry to dive into, but the existence of these different continents are merely the first layer. People's perception of poetry adds an extra layer of convolution. Every person has a unique take on the art form. Everyone sees it differently, which poses a question. What do you see when you think of poetry?
When I think of poetry, I think of birds flapping their wings. I think of white linen sheets blowing in the wind. I think of The Greatest Showman scene with Hugh Jackman running around the rooftop with the sheets blowing. I think of rhythm, and I think of flow and fluidity.
Leaves and a nice blue sky with some clouds and neatly typed words.
When I think of poetry, I think of willow trees in the forest. I also think about the sunset when the sky turns pink and the clouds look like cotton candy. I also think of a big, wide field with grain glowing in the sunlight.
When I see poetry, I think of the expression of humanity and feelings and all kinds of things. I basically just see the products of the past and the prototypes for things that are to come. It's the deepest insight to thoughts, emotions, and lifestyles.
When I think of poetry, I think of a rainforest. Or I think of the sunset at a beach. Or I think of an open field and a bunch of stars in the night sky.
When I think of poetry, I see a girl sitting on a beach overlooking the sunset. The sky is a beautiful mix of purple and orange, and in her lap she has a flower-decorated notebook. And as she jots down stanzas, she occasionally looks up to take in the view.
When I think of poetry, I see dusty bookshelves, aged paper, jazz vinyls, and lit candles that are almost burnt out. I see quill pens, typewriters, and coffee mugs. I think of classic writers like William Shakespeare, Homer, and Edgar Allan Poe. I think of literary pieces like the Odyssey, Romeo and Juliet, and even the Bible. I also associate poetry with nature. I think it's because poetry to me is alive. It is a reflection of the soul who produced it. When I think of poetry, I see trees, lots of trees, and flowers. I see the color green, and sometimes brown. I think about living creatures, from the tiniest bumblebee to the great big blue whale. I think of the poetry books that sit on my shelves. I think of my own poetry that I have written over the years. All those answers to the question were different, but they all have one thing in common. None of them mention technology, which should make sense because who would associate poetry with technology? However, we often fail to realize that poetry now has evolved far beyond the page. It has been advancing at a rapid rate, seeping into the digital realm. Poetry on paper is not as common as it once was. Even my own poetry is no longer found jotted down in a notebook, but typed up in my Notes app. In today's day and age, poetry can be found right in your back pocket on a little machine called a mobile phone. It is found on social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok, making art more accessible than ever before. Not only has poetry become more accessible, but it has also become more heterogeneous. It comes in forms that would not have been possible only 2 decades ago. Poetry now can be created through virtual realities, digital archives, and scientific concepts and codes. I became concerned that traditional poetry is at risk of being overpowered and undervalued due to the rise of digital poetry. What if digital trends dismiss the traditional forms of writing, creating a generational gap in appreciation and skill? Where is the balance between innovation and preservation? Digital poetry is evolving at a rapid rate and expanding in multiple different directions. Is traditional poetry dying? Poetry exists in everything around us. It just takes a creative mind to see it and mold it into a literary piece. Traditional poetry is not obsolete. It simply has evolved and relocated into digital spaces where it continues to evolve and inspire a new generation of artists. Young people, such as myself, are actively composing and consuming poetry online. Traditional poetic techniques like metaphors, similes, and hyperbole partner with digital tools like images, captions, and hashtags. In the article, #PoetryIsNotDead, Understanding Instagram Poetry Within Transliteracy's Framework, by Kate Kovalik and Jen Scott Curwood, it states, young people may therefore be considered innovators of multimodal writing who employ ever-evolving technologies to engage in authentic literacy practices in digital spaces. Young people are not rejecting traditional poetry, but rather revitalizing it. They are innovating the art form while maintaining its traditional essence. The article also points out that the goal of many young artists is to have their poetry in print. Instagram is merely the space where you post stuff so people can find you and you can create an audience that later buy your book. Traditional poetry is not dying. It is simply living in different spaces. C.T. Funkhouser, in his book Prehistoric Digital Poetry, emphasizes that as the medium changes, the expressive function of poetry remains the same. He writes, poets and programmers working with hardware and software continue a tradition of writing that merges poetry with image, programmed language, cultural observation, and expressive symbols. He argues that today's poets use digital media to explore the animated materiality of language. He states, language, poetry's principal vehicle, is no longer lodged on a fixed silent page. It enters a dynamic and transmittable circuitry through another, computerized language. The digital world does not limit the art of poetry, but rather expands its forms and audiences without discarding its traditional essence. Funkhouser states, the genre is clearly a plurality. Works created in it branch from these stems. Poetry is not dead, it's just different. It lives and thrives in new spaces, including this one, this video. As long as art keeps us alive, I think we will do what we can to keep art alive.